there was the idea that we could see human society as a system into which we could send signals and change behavior. I mean, that's the idea of the one child policy, that we could treat human population as a giant system that we could send information into and change the direction it was going.
With me today I have Dylan, also known as DylanLeviKing. He's a writer and translator who's interested in East Asian politics and culture. He's also interested in things like illegal drug markets, and also, more importantly and relevant for our conversation today, cybernetics, which is also known as the theory of control. We've talked about a whole variety of topics, ranging from what is cybernetics exactly, and how did it actually shape itself into affecting many different policies we saw in the 20th and 21st century, like the one-child policy, for example. We also juxtapose the different versions of cybernetics between the East and the West. We've talked about scientism, which is the view that science is all there is to be when it comes to making decisions and how we should conduct our lives. We've also talked about the nature and philosophy of democracies and whether they're actually possible even in the first place. I've been really excited to talk to Dylan about the things we talked about, and I hope you actually find this conversation beneficial.
Pretty much everybody uses that nowadays, and it's so those translators have been kind of quick to get on generative AI stuff.
Yep.
The problem is that it's not quite perfect, and a lot of publishers would like to just run something through ChatGPT and then have the translator edit it after, which is not really, doesn't make for a very good reading experience in the end.
Yep. Yes, I think I noticed this with even other domains. Like, people started to they put their foot on the water with the generative AI, and then they kind of edit their way from there. They don't actually build it from scratch. So I think this is a very common trend that is kind of, shaping itself in many different domains in some ways. But I agree with you. I think when it comes to languages, especially like Mandarin or Arabic, from my experience, it seems like the generative AIs are not even close to being very good, let's say. They're kind of good. They can give you a general scheme of the language, but they're not as good as they could be, definitely.
Yeah, that's right. Like Chinese is a very old language, and embedded within it are many things that can be interpreted in different ways or must be explained to somebody. So somebody reading it along could get the literal meaning. A Chinese phrase like a rabbit. Somebody is waiting beside a tree stump for a rabbit, which is the ChatGPT or DeepL, Google Translate might translate it literally as somebody's waiting beside a tree stump for a rabbit. But it's actually a long story. It's a story about a hunter is walking through the woods and sees a rabbit run into a tree stump and die. So the man keeps waiting beside the tree stump for more rabbits to come. That kind of thing is still very tricky. And, cultural allusions, like if this text is talking about another text, but maybe it's just using like one or two words. If somebody's an educated person in that language, they'll right away know, that he's talking about a book written, this such and such a book. But it will happen eventually with translation software, perhaps, but it's not quite there yet.
Yeah, for sure. Yes. I think I was very impressed by the book, to be honest. The chapter you've written in that book, it was a very good overview of cybernetics. I actually, I guess, shifting the gears to cybernetics right away.
Yeah.
I think the only work that I've written when it comes to cybernetics is that one and Norbert Wiener. I kind of read his works a little bit, and I kind of think I have an overview, and I thought it would be just interesting to kind of discuss those things in detail, I guess.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So I want to start from the place of what specifically. I think the question will be, I guess, two-layered. The first question would be, what got you interested in cybernetics? Because I think it will be a good way to kind of understand where it's going. Because it might seem like cybernetics is too broad to be applicable, but I think if we start from what got you interested in that, it would be more clear for me and the listeners. And the second question is, what is cybernetics from your description?
Sure.
Yeah.
What got me interested in it was I was very interested. Is actually literature got me interested in cybernetics, which seems kind of strange. It's cybernetics is a very scientific, mathematics-driven way of thinking about the world. So when I went back to Chinese literature of the 1980s and the late 1970s, I saw all these people, these poets and writers, talking about the world in a cybernetic sense, and I thought, that's very, very strange. Why are these educated people in Beijing in 1983 and later on trying to understand the world through cybernetics? And it's sort of a history that's been buried or is sort of unknown in the West, that there was a sort of fad or a boom of cybernetics in China in the early 1980s, and that swept up everyone. There was whether they were poets or writers or filmmakers, it was a very attractive idea, a very attractive way to understand the world for those people who were, in a sense, scrambling for something to explain the world.
Yeah.
Because suddenly in 1978, 76, nobody is interested in Maoism anymore or communism. And so that's when cybernetics is introduced as sort of a way to explain the world. It's introduced at the highest levels of government. Um, we can get into the other things later, but the one child policy is sort of a cybernetic policy, and the interest in planning the economy, planning a capitalist economy, was
Hmm.
also a cybernetic project, and it sort of cascaded down from there to the from the government, from the state down to the poets.
Interesting.
Uh,
So, yep. So when you say cybernetic thinking, what do you exactly think about when you say like cybernetic thinking? I guess this is another route to, I guess, ask the question, what is cybernetics in some way?
yeah, that's the best question to ask, because I never cybernetics is sort of a word that disappeared, at least from English.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
something that was replaced by other words like AI and cyberspace and those sorts of things. So it wasn't a word that was in my vocabulary growing up. I wouldn't try to understand the internet as a cybernetic system, or understand any sort of networks as a cybernetic system. It's a word that is most closely identified in the West, I think, still with the late World War II, early Cold War projects connected with what cybernetics was first for, which was aiming things, aiming rockets, and controlling weapons systems. So the most simplest explanation would be a feedback loop. So you've got a rocket flying into the sky. You're at the controls of it. You you know adjust the attitude of the rocket, and you get a signal back to you that that the that the direction it's going, the speed it's going, has changed, and you send another signal back into this loop. So that's cybernetics at the most basic way, a
Mm.
basic sense. And then there was, from there, something called second order cybernetics, or cybernetics of cybernetics, which was basically taking that basic idea of the feedback loop, um, to understand larger systems. And second order cybernetics came to include systems theory and various strains of mathematics, ways to understand how a signal can be sent into a system and change it and receive feedback from that system, how to make
Hmm.
changes in huge systems by sending in information. If that,
Mm.
I hope it's a very tough thing to explain. It's a question I've been asked a lot. What is cybernetics? And it's a very difficult question to answer, because
Yeah, that's, I think the way you laid it out is pretty clear. Like the first step, or maybe the first order cybernetics, is sort of understanding that there must be sort of like a continuous signal
right,
in order to understand the system, let's say, in general. And then the second step, or the second order cybernetics, is almost saying like, what should we do with that signal, basically?
yeah,
And it's
exactly.
saying that, yeah, it's almost like the practical side of cybernetics in some ways.
And then it was sort of expanded out to include not just like an electrical system, or a rocket in flight, or a series of rockets in flight, or let's say weather, something like that. It was in the United States and other places, the Soviet Union, China for sure, there was the idea that we could see human society as a system into which we could send signals and
Mm.
change behavior. I mean, that's the idea of the one child policy, that
Yep.
we could treat human population as a giant system that we could send information into and change the direction it was going.
Hmm. Yeah, so it kind of started with a concrete engineering problem and then it leaked itself into other places like politics and stuff, which I think we'll be getting into
Yeah,
in a
that's
bit.
exactly
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So could you, I guess this idea sounds a little bit broad because when I first read about cybernetics, I was like, okay, why should we create a discipline out of this idea? It seems very basic. Like even Norbert Wiener also mentioned this idea that he said that the most, I guess I have to justify for people that this idea is not too commonplace. It seems like a very basic idea when we talk about it, but I think when we start to speak about the history, it might get clearer on how why it should actually why it was, I guess, invented into a discipline. So if you could just, I guess, walk through the history from as far as you know when it comes to Chinese cybernetics and its applications, maybe talk about figures like Qian Song, I think his name was,
Yeah,
and all those different figures. So yeah.
sure. So Qian Xuesen, he's a Chinese man. He born in China and ends up going to MIT and going to Caltech. He's his first love was locomotives, but once he got to America, he got interested in jet propulsion and aerodynamics, those sorts of things. And in World War II, of course, those things could be put to the use of missiles. You know, the the Nazis were, and even the Soviet Union perhaps were a little bit ahead of the United States as far as missile technology went. So talents like Chen from China were very valuable. So when he was in America, he was exposed to all those early, first order cybernetics thinkers who were trying to figure out how to control a rocket, how to figure out how to
Mhm.
control a firing system on a gun. And he took that into he sort of expanded the discipline out to include what he called um, engineering cybernetics, which was sort of taking larger systems, more concrete systems still, and doing something with them and sending information into them to change them. He ended up running into trouble. The Americans, after the war, started rooting out everybody who they thought might be a communist. So they went after, anybody. A lot of them were Eastern European Jews who got in trouble. A lot of them. Chen Shui-sen was not a communist, but they branded him as a communist mostly because of his friends with those Eastern European Jews who had sympathies with the Soviet Union. They told him he had to leave the country. They kept him under house arrest for a while and then sent him back in the late 1950s. And when he got to China, he saw this country that was undergoing a revolution, which was a scientific revolution. Also, the
Mhm.
Chinese got from the Soviet Union this idea that scientific progress was incredibly important, and building up science and industry was crucial. So Qian got there and started thinking about how he could change the world. He couldn't really do it in America. They were just letting him build missiles. But when he got to China, he saw what I'm doing in science, these ideas of cybernetics that I'm applying to concrete things could apply to all of society. They
Mhm.
want to plan this entire country. They want to connect the economy to agriculture um, to everything planned and industrialized in this project of industrialization. So he started proposing various things. This is the middle of the Great Leap Forward. Actually, many people are starving at that time, but he saw the possibility of using science to guide China. It didn't work out that way, unfortunately. We know modern Chinese history was quite a bit more tragic than probably he imagined it would be. The Great Leap Forward which ended in serious famines, was followed by the Cultural Revolution, where they were still industrializing. They still built nuclear weapons in that period. They tested their first nuclear weapons right in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. But he really couldn't do anything at that time. There was also no computers. There were some a small. There wasn't the computing power that he would have had if he was at Caltech or at MIT or in the working for the United States government or even the Soviet government. So it's all stops. It all goes on ice. He doesn't do anything for most of the 1960s and 70s. And when the 1970s draw to a close, Mao Zedong is dead. Deng Xiaoping comes out and says, forget about politics. We're just going to use science to solve everything. We're going to go back to
Deng
science.
Xiaoping is actually the person who preceded Mao, right? Right
That's
after
right.
Mao
That's
died.
right.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Not immediately. There was one guy in the middle, but he's not important. He came out
Okay.
and said, "Forget about politics. I don't want to hear about communism. I don't want to. I'll hear about communism, but you better say communism is science. We're going to use science to guide everything." All those scientists who were digging trenches in the Cultural Revolution or working on a farm, they're back. Those are the people I want to command my country, command the state, and command the economy. So the only people who really could do that, who had an idea of how to do that, were military scientists and cyberneticists who were in Qian's circle. They had supercomputers. The few that were in the country were in defense establishments within the state. So they also, you need to know what's going on in the rest of the world at that time. Cyberneticists are really interested in building models of the entire world and of seeing the entire world as a system. So in 1978, the cyberneticists start going out of China and talking to these people who are building models of the world and they're particularly focused on population as a problem. They're really panicked that
The
population is
Malthusian
taking
idea of overpopulation.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And so they bring those ideas back to China. The idea that population is super scary, and the idea that cyberneticists can you put their ideas not just to guiding missiles, but to guiding the trajectory of, let's say, a population graph, or the trajectory of the price of a commodity, like the price of wheat or something like that, by sending information into a complex system, whether that's the economy or whether that's a human population. So Qian and his buddies basically are put in charge of lots of stuff because they're very trustworthy. They were defense scientists, so some of them helped build nuclear weapons and build missiles to deliver them. They're very trustworthy, and they're sort of unleashed on all these problems that China imagines itself to have, whether that's planning the economy after you exit pure socialism, or planning population after you decide that it's a big worry. So I mean, in a sense, though, those people who in the late 1970s, early 1980s were so important, their legacy continues until today with how the Chinese state sees the use of science and this sort of cybernetic thinking as a way to plan everything. So even if we don't use the word cybernetics, it's still in its Chinese form very, very important to how the Chinese conceive of something like planning a city or planning law, how to conduct law enforcement, things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't use the word cybernetics, obviously, but a word in Chinese, 系统工程, which means systems engineering, but it still underlays everything. So that word, that tradition that started when Qian came back in the 1950s continues up until the present, even if the word has
Interesting.
disappeared from English. Yeah.
Yeah. I think when I think about it, Chinese cybernetics specifically, the way you described it is almost like scientism on steroids, basically. It's the idea that science could solve all problems. And it seems like we use different words for it today, scientism or whatever.
Yep.
but it seems like the basic idea is really the same. But you mentioned that the predecessor of Mao actually moved away from politics, but it's not obvious to me how one can operate things without politics. Did they have this misconception that you can operate things only based on science? Because if we take the Western distinction of the is and ought, what is and what we should do, science only talks about what is basically, and it doesn't talk about what we should do. But did they kind of brush over that distinction in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, it is like you said, it is scientism on steroids, and that was China in the 1970s, in the 1980s. I think there's still a big strain of that now.
Yep.
Deng
Yes.
Xiaoping said, just believed that scientists were able to apply principles that were absolute. That were able to have access to a kind of knowledge that could be tested, could be proven, and wasn't simply Marxism is itself conceived of as a science. The immortal science of Marxism, and it's based on economic scientific principles. So it was sort of substituting these a sort of grab bag of all scientific thought for what Marxism had become in China, which was kind of a crazy Maoist thing. So in a way, it was sort of turning back to the principles that the Soviet Union and China and all these other communist um, nations were built upon. That there wasn't a that there was something to be found in science that was eternal and testable and absolute, and the country could be run on that, whether it was Marxist economics or cybernetics or any scientific discipline.
Mm. Yeah,
And
that's
and it
interesting.
actually, um, in the Tien, imagine that cybernetics, that his systems engineering would be something that could subsume all scientific disciplines into itself. He imagined it as a new discipline to replace all the others, to be something that could be used in planning the state, but also almost all aspects of scientific inquiry and also daily life in a way.
Mm. Yeah, that seems to be a very much misunderstanding on the way science works. And I'm curious, have those people, for example, who made those decisions, like who made those philosophies, I guess, like were they scientists themselves to kind of understand those things, or were they just talking from their, I guess, outsider's perspective? Because it seems like a very huge like misunderstanding of the way science works in some ways.
Yeah, it is. It is. The interesting thing is that Chen tried to rebuild the scientific method. Um, he had an idea
Wow.
called qualitative to quantitative thinking. So his idea was that you could observe a phenomenon, and you would, let's say you one of his key examples was ESP. The idea that I could read this book without looking at it. I can read the contents of the text
Ah,
and say what's in it. So
okay.
his idea was he saw this, he observed it, and then what you would need to do with his new method is take that observation, and instead of disproving or proving it, take that observation and build it into a theory. It's kind of tough to explain his conception of these things, but take the
Mhm.
qualitative and use data and use observations put all together into a quantitative answer. So I'm not going to take no for an answer that somebody is actually using their mind to read the book. I'm going to use methods. I'm going to find data to prove that what I observed is actually what happened. Whereas a usual
Mm.
scientific method, you would be looking to explain how that trick I'm doing is accomplished. Kind of trying to deduce what is actually happening there. But that was sort of his idea. So a lot of his ideas, even if they were branded as cybernetics or branded as scientific, were sort of on shaky scientific ground.
Mm.
That he
Yeah.
did get into ESP and telekinesis and those sorts of things at that period too, which were completely pseudoscientific ideas, but they really appealed to him and really informed how he thought about the world through this
Mm,
time.
yeah.
So yeah,
So,
they were scientists, but some of them were kind of kooky. Some of them were a little bit crazy.
okay.
They knew
Yeah.
how to guide a missile, but they when it came to like understanding how do you build a model of a human population, they weren't population scientists.
Yeah.
They didn't have the grounding. So they thought we have supercomputers, we can plan this kind of thing if we send in the right information. But they were misled, they were misguided.
They were kind of the epitome of shut up and calculate sort of phenomena in some
Exactly
ways, I think.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of scientists, even maybe less so nowadays because of the internet and just access to many different information, but I think many scientists have this scientistic, I guess, view of the world that everything could, like, we could apply science everywhere, but that doesn't seem to be true, at least as we progress and understand more things about the complex systems in general. It seems like science cannot actually be applied to all things. There seems to be things that are extra scientific, I guess.
And
So,
that's like
yeah.
that's part of what Chen was trying to do. He would see these phenomenon that he would have big gaps in his explanations of the world, and he would bring in these sort of metaphysical ideas to put into this new system, this new scientific method that he was developing. But
Mm,
it was in a way, yeah. I mean, it's a bit, it was misguided or almost a bit arrogant that he
yeah.
thought he could do this.
And interestingly, actually, Norbert Wiener talked about this in his book. I kind of picked it up, but I'm not sure if that was his full view. Maybe he changed his views, but he mentioned something about the danger of applying cybernetics, or the idea of that we can control that thing on social systems. He kind of warned about that, but I'm not sure how I'm not sure if the Chinese cyberneticists actually came across that warning from Norbert Wiener or whoever the other founders of cybernetics, I guess.
Right. I don't know either. Norbert Wiener actually went to China in the 30s, and some of the people who that studied under him were there up through the 1970s. But there was a
Mm,
lot of arrogance on those on the part of those people who were defense scientists and who were put in charge of this country, this massive country, and told, you know, we're going to use science to fix everything.
yeah. Yeah, but from your readings, what's the contrast, or I guess the how could we see the differences between the Western application of cybernetics and the Chinese application of cybernetics? Because it seems like the Western conception was more focused on engineering problems, like concrete problems, defense. But were there actualization of the Western, let's say, model that applied into social systems, or was it exclusively the Chinese point of view that was applying it to social systems?
Mm. I mean, there were thinkers in the West who thought it could apply, especially to population, but they were rarely given the chance to carry out those experiments on the level of like uh, Song Jian is a guy who was working with Qian Shui-sen at the time. He was put in charge of so many things of population and of the economy in large part. In Western countries, nobody was given the opportunity. They could write a book about it, or they could have
Ah,
a
okay.
conference about it, but nobody was saying, "See what you can do, see what happens." Yeah,
Yeah. So there was the philosophy was there, but the practicalities were not, I guess, possible in some ways.
yeah. So like when the Chinese went abroad, that's where they were exposed to these ideas that cybernetics could run the entire world. That you know the entire world could be one system with many subsystems within it. So it is an idea that comes from outside China and was introduced to China, but you know nobody was given the freedom to fool around with it.
Yeah. They only had the facility to kind of fool around with the engineering problems, but not necessarily the social problems in some ways.
Right. Sure.
Yeah. So there was an idea that was mentioned in the book that talked about the opposition of cybernetics with philosophy. And I'm not sure I actually understood that point completely. So could you just maybe say more about this point of the opposition of cybernetics to philosophy? because there seems to
Mm.
be a lot of philosophical assumptions within cybernetics itself. Like, even if you say, I want to apply cybernetics, there are different ways to apply that cybernetic idea. So you can have a cybernetic idea that is based on decentralization. You can have a cybernetic idea that is based on centralization. So it seems like there are a lot of philosophical baggage that is thrown on the cybernetic scene. So I'm not sure
Mm.
how it's in opposition with philosophy.
Right. You know, the that book opens with an essay by a man called Yu Kuei,
Yeah.
who writes that um, Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, saw in cybernetics the sort of resolution of Western philosophy,
Yes.
which is I don't claim to understand what he meant by
Mm.
that, but I think for the cyberneticists of China in the 1980s, up to the 1990s, it's sort of the same that that philosophical questions and philosophical inquiry could be could be moved under this larger umbrella of
Mm.
cybernetics, which I think deserves an explanation. I'm not sure I can give it, but the idea that that systems science and the study of systems would be able to answer philosophical questions that
Mm.
stretch back to the beginning of Western or Eastern philosophy. Um, to be clear, I don't think they were successful in that. So it's sort of I don't think that's a very satisfying answer,
Yeah.
but there was sort of the idea that philosophy was could be taken under the system of cybernetics, could be
Yeah.
that science could sort of resolve those metaphysical or philosophical questions we had.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's still even a very common view, but I'm pretty sure, like, as far as I understand it, I think it's a misunderstanding of philosophy and science because, as I said, a lot of those claims are actually philosophical claims themselves. So it seems quite like paradoxical, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah, I mean that's
So,
the idea that sort of of scientism, that science and in this case cybernetics has answers that are eternal and absolute, and will sort of complete philosophy in our time. We'll be able to calculate the answers to philosophical questions. I think that's
yeah.
how Chen and others thought about things.
Mm,
They
yeah.
they saw metaphysical phenomena existing, but as something that could be put into their system, whether they understood them or not.
Mm,
But I mean that's not
yeah.
a very good answer. There's a lot of I would really recommend people read that the Yu Kuei's essay at the start of that, Cybernetics for the 21st
Yeah.
Century, because
Yeah. It's really good, actually.
he's a very sharp person of sort of understanding how philosophy fits into cybernetics.
Mm. Yeah. There are a lot of good insights, actually, on that first chapter. So I also recommend it. I think I would love to just take a step back and see how this is probably historical rather than a cybernetic question, but I would love to take a step back and see why did communism itself, or even you could say centralization, gain so much popularity in China? Because there seems to be a general Western narrative when it comes to the Western, I guess, espousal of communism when it comes to the Soviet Union or other Western countries, Germany, whatever. There seems to be a narrative that there was the pre Enlightenment period, and then there was the Enlightenment where there was the Industrial Revolution there. And then people kind of, a lot of the scene changed on people. So it was kind of inevitable that someone like Marx would kind of emerge and lead some kind of a movement, let's say. So there seems to be a coherent narrative on why communism emerged in the West, but I'm not sure if the same, let's say, narrative could be applied to China. Were there other, let's say, seeds that kind of cultivated communism or centralization gaining popularity in China? Or how would you
Right.
think about this from a historical perspective?
I think it has the same roots. Like if you go to the look at the people who, the early communists and the early sort of progressive or left-wing thinkers in China, many of them were under the influence of Western thought. The idea that in something called the May 4th movement in China in the in the early part of the last century, where the thinkers were coming out and saying we need two things in China. We need Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. And what was seen in communism was a sort of scientific method to understand the world around you. There was a something very appealing about the ideas of communism as a science and as a politics in China. And I don't think it's very different from communism in the West is coming out of um, the project of the Enlightenment, the perfection of the Enlightenment. It's really the same kind of thing. There are probably things in Chinese culture that would that would have pushed people towards the particular form of communism that was pursued. There are many echoes of traditional culture and traditional politics and traditional organization of society in the sort of communism that was put into practice in China. This idea
Mm,
of intense organization of society and intense the list making. Everybody is recorded in a book, and their place of work is recorded in a book, and their what they do in the marketplace is recorded in a book. There's sort of something that's there in traditional Chinese culture that's very adaptable to the sort of communism and Marxism that they were interested in China. But for a large part, it was if you understand why communism emerged in the West and how they thought about it there, you can understand how it came about in China. Other seeds, there were, if China had gone another direction, there were other seeds. There were anarchists in China at this time.
mm,
Some early Communist Party people are very sort of libertarian socialists who believe in a very different kind of communism or socialism than came about in China. There was also the possibility of fascism in China. There, the people connected with Chiang Kai-shek, who later went to Taiwan. At the same time, there were the brown shirts and the black shirts in Europe. There were the blue shirts of Chiang Kai-shek, and he imagined a Chinese fascism based around traditional Chinese sort of religious practices or kind of basically secret societies that were existing at that time.
mm.
Sort of a mystical Chinese fascism was perhaps a possibility, another seed at that time, but that didn't happen.
Yeah, I think also one missing part of the narrative when it comes to, I guess, the move from tribalism to individualism. I think this is very much related to the state wanting, or I guess, communism emerging as a thought, as an idea. Because if you think about it, the state's objective is to control. And in the
Mm,
past, it used to be the family or the tribe. But then as we moved through individualism, it seems to me like it was inevitable for something like communism to emerge as soon as individualism emerged, because if you as a state your objective is to control, then if the most fundamental unit is the family, you're going to control the family. If the most fundamental unit is the individual, you're going to control the individual. So I think this is also an interesting link when it comes to why ideas like communism kind of gained popularity, and I think it's usually brushed under the rug because we think of individualism as something that is coherent more with liberal views or progressive views, but I don't think that's the case. I think a lot of the times it actually could be linked to the even the emergence of things like communism and other stuff like that.
sure,
So
I think that's right.
yeah. So from your perspective, would you say that cybernetics, I guess the interpretation of cybernetics when it comes to thinkers was more leaning towards centralization or decentralization in general, not necessarily only restricted to China, but when it comes to other thinkers?
I
Was
think
it leaning more towards, yeah.
very much towards centralization, because the way you manage a system is you need to conceive of a system and push everything into it, push everything into control, under the control of the controller, the person who's sending out the signal into the system. If there are things outside of the system that are uncontrollable, then you're not perfecting your cybernetic system. So on the
Mm,
question of like population and controlling populations, if you have a bunch of people who are not being counted and people who are living on the margins of this system, it's ineffective. It doesn't work. So yeah, I think it is to it will all those things were pushing towards a centralization. You can see where these ideas took root in a large part were very centralized societies, like the Soviet Union had certain troubles with cybernetics in the past, that clashing with how they ran things, but it took root in the Soviet Union, and it took root in the American defense establishment, and it took root in socialist Chile, those kind of places. Even Japan has a strain of cybernetic thought that's connected
mm,
with planning society and planning politics. It didn't take root in other places. It suits a system that is highly centralized, and it's intended to centralize, if that makes
mm.
sense.
Yeah. And I think the interesting part was that the ideas of cybernetics kind of emerged from this idea that the world is connected or interconnected. And you can also see it in the book which you co-authored, is in the chapter that was talking about Leibniz. And they mentioned that the cybernetic, let's say, emergence of the idea of a feedback was an idea that was fundamental to that, was that the world is interconnected. And
Right.
it seems like it's kind of paradoxical, because as soon as you say that the world is interconnected, the first thought you think about is that the world is just too complicated to control. I'm just going to
Mm.
leave it. So that would lead more towards decentralization. But then the applications, as cybernetics kind of progress, it shifted towards, so there's, it shifted towards centralization. So I think there's some kind of a paradox there that is very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And China nowadays, one of the ways to understand China nowadays is to understand this central fact of that they would like to have a cybernetic system in place to plan everything. So everything needs to be centralized. Politics needs to be directed from the center. The economy needs to be directed from the center, because if you have this sort of chaotic local economies, it might be very good and drive the economy, drive economic growth, but it's very hard to control. You're always grappling with what are these things outside of the control of the center. So I think that's been a big way. That's a way to understand China's centralization and drive towards centralization over the past, 100 years, but especially over the past 20 and 30 and so on.
Yeah. I think even if we take the idea of cybernetics, which an idea that is fundamental to that is control, I think it also leaked itself into Western countries as well, but maybe in other ways, in other directions. I think China is probably more. I think of the contrast between China and the Western countries. China is almost like the over-caring mother in some ways. It's just trying to control everything. And then the US is the nonchalant mother that, and not necessarily the US, but Western countries in general, is like the less caring mother in some ways. Because if you look at the general metrics of, for example, society, it seems like safety in China is, it looks okay, at least. There is a lot of people who are exiting or going out of poverty and all those different metrics. But then when you look at the West, there's increased homelessness and all these different things. So I'm not sure how you would think about those two analogies. Would you say that they're kind of accurate when it comes to the governments and their approaches, or is that not very much accurate? And
Yeah,
there's
and
a
I
lot
think
of, I guess, sorry, not to cut you off, but I think there are
right.
a lot of assumptions in this, because to say that China is an overcaring mother is to assume that the Chinese government actually cares about the people. And I'm not sure that claim is true, because I think a lot of leaders have shown that they don't really care about the population, but they care about other things, let's say. And
Yeah,
yeah,
I think it's also the the methods that are necessary to run a state like the Chinese would like to run it. So if you want to have control, absolute control over a massive network of surveillance and police to maintain safety at a level that they do, you probably need to use some rather methods that would not be tolerated in Western countries, whether that's um, you know if you let's say you're running this massive surveillance network and you find out that there's a drug market operating. To maintain the control of this cybernetic system of surveillance and policing, you need to go in and arrest everybody there and either send
yes.
them to jail or send them for drug rehabilitation or kill them. And that's how you maintain a control of such a system. Whereas the American system can it's much more decentralized, so it can tolerate those sort of pockets of chaos on the
Mm.
edges of what's under their control.
Ah, okay, interesting. So it's not necessarily a matter of intent. It's not, I don't think, like, I think what you're saying is that the intent is not necessarily different when it comes to the leaders of the Chinese, let's say, Communist Party and the Western countries. But the system itself kind of allows for the chaos of, for example, homelessness or less safety.
Right.
Uh, it's almost like an exchange to freedom, I guess, whatever that means. But initially, like, I guess a shorthand way to understand it is just freedom. Like freedom,
Right.
kind of, it necessitates the it necessitates foregoing the safety in some ways.
Mm. I think
Yeah.
the last time we talked to you, you asked what's the meaning of freedom in China versus in the West. And
Yes.
I think it's a very different idea.
Exactly.
This is sort of going. This is sort of not answering the question, but I there is the idea that massive centralized system is guarantees a certain type of freedom that is not the Western conception of freedom necessarily,
Exactly.
of being able to
Yeah.
take drugs and being able to enjoy yourself in a certain way that the
Mm,
Chinese are willing to accept and are find very attractive the idea of everything being controlled from the
mm.
center for the benefit of themselves, for to guarantee their own freedom to walk on the street and enjoy a city without people selling drugs on the corner or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, there are interesting contrasts between the two systems, I guess. It's very interesting. So when it comes to tech, I guess this is also something that kind of affected cybernetic thought. So would you say that you lean more towards the techno optimist perspective, which says that tech will only lead to, I guess, more human flourishing? Or are you more leaning towards the techno pessimist perspective, which says that tech will only lead to more tyranny from governments and whatever other institutions or whatever the case might be? So, which side would you lean towards? Or are you just basically a realist who's assessing every tech and how it could be interpreted?
Mm. I don't think I'm a pessimist, but I think perhaps I do lean towards the approach of the Chinese in a way that I think technological progress is something that must be monitored by the state and directed by the state. And if it's put in the hands of simply corporations, it the future looks very dark in that sense. I think technological progress is something that of course we can't just set aside from the first time humans picked up a rock and used it to etch something in stone. Technology has become a part of ourselves. I don't think we can imagine, at least on a global scale, some sort of reversal of the trajectory we're moving on right now. But
Mm,
I think that trajectory, of course, needs to be guided by somebody who has an idea of where it's going. And
yeah.
I don't know. I think there's not many choices other than to say, um, we need sort of a. I don't know if we need the Chinese model where this technology is being put quite to the same use as it is, but some sort of alternative to, I think, the Western model of move fast and break stuff. When we reach the point of you know um, general artificial intelligence and those kind of things, to leave that in the hands of a few corporations which have captured the state also is a very risky thing that makes me feel very pessimistic. So
Yeah,
the
it's
answer
interesting.
is neither. I'm
Yeah.
optimistic and pessimistic.
Yeah. I think this problem is tricky for me because usually there are a lot of, I guess, historical examples of the state kind of abusing that power in some ways, that power of regulating. So it's a very
Mhm.
difficult problem to wrap my head around, actually. Sometimes I'm kind of leaning more towards just at least initially leave it as it is, not necessarily with the control, because I think the control of the state usually it kind of implies the abuse of power by necessity. It's going to be like a slippery slope of just basically banning things. So it's a very tricky problem to think about, actually, from that
Yeah, I
perspective.
mean, what do you call yourself? Are you a tech optimist or pessimist in general, if you had to answer?
I'm a techno realist, I call myself. Like, I
Okay.
analyze, yeah, I kind of analyze every technology and think about it from, I think every technology has both good sides and bad sides to it in some ways.
Yeah,
And I think the techno optimists are wrong in the sense that they have it's almost like a false positive vision where they think every problem could be solved by technology. And then you
right,
have the techno pessimists on the other side. They have a false negative vision where they think no problem could be solved by technology.
right.
And I think in that sense, I'm neither. I'm kind of I kind of assess every technology in its own and see whether it's more leaning towards having good or having good consequences or bad consequences. It kind of depends in some ways.
There's a French philosopher called Bernard Stiegler. He's passed away, but he sort of promotes this idea. He promoted this idea of a pharmacological approach to thinking about these things. In that, these think of it as a medicine, which in the right measure can cure, and in the wrong measure can kill. And as a way of thinking about technology. Of course, it's impossible to completely at this point to completely abandon and avoid technologies. You asked about translation and AI. For me to completely avoid those things would be foolhardy, would be silly, but it must be very correctly incorporated into how I do my work and how I live my life.
Mm.
And I think all of us, I think if you're a techno pessimist and you just a purely a techno pessimist, you're sort of checking out of history. You're leaving the
Yeah,
conversation. You're
exactly.
not there. You're not willing to turn these technologies into something for the betterment of your community and of the people around you. So in that sense, I'm definitely not a pessimist.
Yeah, agreed. Do you have some sympathy for people who don't like to get into politics? And I've the reason why I ask this is because I've noticed a lot of people kind of they criticize the idea that you should get into politics because it's just so depressing, I guess, in some ways. And
Yeah,
do you have some sympathy for the viewpoint that doesn't like to, I guess, dive into politics? Or do you think that politics is actually a necessary condition to understand the human condition? Because I see a lot of quote unquote intellectuals who like to get into all different sorts of domains or subjects, but then when it comes to politics, they're like it's a red flag. But it seems to
Yeah.
me like politics is almost like a necessary condition to understand the human condition as a whole.
Yeah, I think like modern political discourse. I know some people who are very smart and understand their field of study very well, and when it comes to modern political discourse, they sound very silly. They sound very stupid. It politics talking about politics sort of makes you perhaps makes you stupid because the level of discourse is so low. But of course, I guess I conceive of politics as you know, I've been here talking about the state and communism and those sorts of things, but I think for most people, they should understand politics on a very local level of, you know, the politics of their apartment building and the politics of their local city council and the politics of their church or the politics of their family, and build something from that very low level. Um,
Mhm.
you know, I really, you know, I can give an opinion on something like international relations, but it's very meaningless. It's very uninteresting to me. It's like talking about you know, a football game, something like that.
Mhm.
um, the great, because it's very easy. It's very easy to do. It's very difficult to go and talk to the people who live in your apartment building, the people who work on your local city council, and to actually change the world there. So I think most people who think they're involved in politics or observe politics or have thoughts about it are have very irrelevant, meaningless thoughts that they shouldn't share with anyone ever.
Interesting. And when you say politics, you mean only contempt, like not necessarily the political systems, like talking, for example, about communism and stuff like that. That wouldn't you consider that also politics, or is it something different that you mean?
That's politics too, but I think those sorts of big concepts of politics and of political philosophy don't necessarily need to be applied to national systems or global systems, but we can take those ideas down to how we plan a city or plan a neighborhood or plan a local council, those sorts of things.
Mm,
I don't know if that answers the question.
yeah. Yeah, I think in some ways, the way I think about it is that politics is almost, in some ways, at least some parts of it. Obviously, there are other parts of it that are kind of less worthy of speaking about in some ways, but I think of politics as contemporary history in some ways. The reason
Right.
why I like to, yeah, because sometimes I think to understand the human condition, you need to understand the political states of the world in some ways. Like you have to be, I guess, engaging in that part of the discourse to understand even more about the world. And it seems to me like dissociating from the political discourse is kind of, and as I said, it's really important to kind of distinguish the less worthy of speaking politics and then the more worthy speaking of politics. So an example I give is the political systems. For example, if you understand or if you read into the history of, for example, 20th century Europe, it's kind of a necessary condition to understand Europe. You have to get into the politics of it in some ways. So I think
Yeah.
this also applies to the contemporary days in some ways. And I don't know why some people kind of like to read about the history but don't like to get into the contemporary politics, because today's politics is going to be tomorrow's history in some ways. So that's how I think about it. But I agree with you in some ways in the sense that there are political things that are less worthy of speaking about, and they're kind of more so like a small talk sort of thing.
Yeah, but I think you're right there that that it is. I wouldn't say to check out of the political discourse entirely, but to or that there's things not worth understanding or analyzing. But these things have a lot of value that I think perhaps people don't, once they understand the history of you know, the Enlightenment or how politics, what sort of politics came out of the Enlightenment, that there are really great ways to apply it in on a smaller scale that can change the world.
Mhm.
Maybe English language political discourse is just so so stupid that I guess I sort of I can sympathize with people who would say, oh, I'm not political, or something like that, even if they obviously are and have political beliefs that they might
Ah,
not
okay.
realize are political beliefs. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think the Western perspective of I don't want to get into politics is a very special one, because I
Mm,
think what people mean by that is usually the two, I guess, the very much contemporary issues like LGBT or whatever. Those are the politics of many Western countries, and that
mm,
is the politics that I don't really that is, I guess, less worthy of speaking.
mm.
But yeah, I guess when you talk about it from other languages perspective, it seems like the political discourse like communism or other things are actually very much worthy of speaking. So yeah, the definition of politics itself is actually very much relevant here.
Mm.
Yeah, so would you say that you've come across any counter arguments when it comes to democracy from the Chinese perspective? Because as we mentioned throughout the discussion or the conversation, there is an inclination in China towards communism. Are there like intellectual arguments against a democracy in the way it could be applied, or is it just something that kind of took its shape historically and they didn't actually talk or get into democracy in and of itself as an argument, let's say?
Sure. Well, the Chinese would say they're democratic. So there's arguments for a different
Ah,
kind of
okay.
democracy. Um, the Chinese do vote in a sense. Some of them cast votes, but usually the individuals are not voting. There's some village elections and whatnot, but they've elect they have a representative drawn from the people who's been voted for by representatives of the people who send people to the National People's Congress in Beijing. So in a way, the Chinese system is still a democratic system, but a very it's sort of a different version of a Western liberal democracy. It's not sort of a completely anti-democratic system. It's just a bizarre kind of
Ah,
to us to Westerners a bizarre kind of democracy. Um, so I think there's a lot of arguments to be made for a different kind of democracy. I mean, coming from the West, I'm not a great supporter of Western liberal democracy. I think it's had some fairly terrible outcomes, as has the Chinese model. Are there arguments for a completely different anti-democratic system, or I wouldn't make them publicly. I would never put myself on record saying that I have a better solution than democracy, whether that's Chinese democracy or something else. There's anti-democratic or non-democratic systems in the world that you could make arguments for. Um,
mm,
the French thinker Foucault was a great fan of Iran. He went to Tehran in the 1970s and saw the possibilities of a theocracy there. He was a Western kind of left leaning thinker, although not a
yeah.
Marxist, and he saw in Iran in after the revolution something really brilliant and a great possibility, and he wrote that down and was attacked relentlessly for it. So I think of him when I think of people making arguments against democracy. I'm not as brave as Foucault to go on record that I think theocracy is a great idea. But yeah, I guess I'm pretty skeptical about democracy, Chinese or Western. But I'm not prepared to defend any alternatives.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the philosophy of democracy because usually when I think about it from a theoretical perspective, it seems like for me sometimes when I think about it, the will of the people is sometimes very much theoretically it's not possible to actualize the will of the people because there's a very much well-known law that is called the power law, which is
Mm,
the 80-20 law. Basically what it says is that a tiny minority of things dictate the outcome, basically. So a tiny minority of cities have all the population, a tiny minority of rivers have all the water, a tiny minority of stars have all the mass, etc. So this is a very general law.
mm,
I think a democracy theoretically is kind of antithetical to the power law, where it's saying that we're going to inverse it. We're going to make it like 80% or whatever to kind of dictate the outcome. But I think that is in opposition with the power law. So if you come along with a political system like a democracy, for example, that says that the will of the people will actualize, theoretically, let's say, it seems to me like there are a lot of many different domains that could be counteracted by that in some ways. Like the economic system could bring about powerful people who kind of end up dictating the leader himself. And it seems like the will of the people is an idea that sometimes the possibility of actualizing the will of the people could actually be questioned, I think, from a
Right.
theoretical perspective. But I'm not sure the practical ramifications of that theoretical basis. It might be false in some ways, but it's something I actually think about when it comes to the will of the people, let's say.
And then you go back to the thing you were talking about before. What is the elementary particle that you're going to organize society around? Is it going to be the individual? Is it going to be the family? And that will
Mm,
have a great bearing on how you conceive of a democracy, or conceive of the ideal political system that carries
mm,
out the will of. Is it the individual, or is it the will of the family? Is it the will of the tribes living under
exactly.
that
Exactly.
system? So yeah, that you know in the West, the idea that the individual is the elementary particle of society is I think has had very negative impacts on Western society as a whole.
Mm,
This idea that everybody is an elementary particle within the system, and we could somehow absorb the will of all of these individuals, and or not just absorb their will, but also guide them as elementary particles is kind of tough, and it's sort of a new idea that doesn't really accord with how human society was organized for the last several thousand years.
mm,
um,
yeah.
you know and it goes back to this idea of cybernetics, that this collection of individuals, perhaps networked together, could come up with could express their will, if you network together all those billions of elementary particle individuals together. Could you perfect the system of democracy by networking everyone together?
Mm.
No, probably not.
Yeah, the way I think about it to add to this point is that I think it's good to have the individual as an elementary particle. It's fine, but to make it the only elementary particle is problematic. I think they should coexist with having, like, the individual should be an elementary particle, but it should be nested within a familial, let's say, structure. So I
Sure.
think the way the Western version of it is that it's again individualism on steroids. Like individualism necessarily is not a bad thing in and of itself, but it should coexist or be, I guess, should have feedback from the family or the tribe or whatever the case might be. But it seems like the virgin or the Western version of individualism is that this individual should be cut from all like feedback and they should only
Yeah.
just act on their whims or whatever. So I think both of those ideas, I think there is almost like a synthesis that could actually perfect this idea of individualism, let's say. This is how
Yeah.
I guess I think about it in some ways.
Yeah. I think that's very similar to the way I think about it as
Mm,
well.
yeah. So I want to go back actually to the one child policy in population. So I guess in some ways we can go back to cybernetics. How from your reading, how did the one child policy kind of be affected from cybernetics? And then maybe we could walk through the history of the one child policy and how it emerged in China and maybe its link to the West or Western ideas.
Yeah. I mean, it goes right back to the start of cybernetics, and those people in China who were planning it. They were missile scientists who, like I said before, thought that the trajectory of a population line, the total fertility rate going up, could be redirected through sending information into a system, which in this case was basically all Chinese people living within the People's Republic of China.
Mm,
And of course, to do so, to send the problem was that there were a lot of sensors, but very few effectors. So it was very easy to get numbers, raw numbers, and somewhat accurate numbers on the number of people and the number of babies being born. But it's actually quite hard to change that, to send that send information into the system that can change that line. You can see it now in countries that want to raise their fertility rate. It's very
Yep.
difficult to do. And in China, it was done somewhat brutally by literally sending people to carry out abortions on unborn children. Um, and it was just connected with that this cybernetic conception of the world, that the world could be, that at least China could be planned and controlled through science. And the one child policy continued from the late 1970s up until a couple years ago. It started to be applied differently, and there were exceptions made, but it continued for years and years, even though it probably wasn't working. Probably as China urbanized, and as it grew wealthier, the population would have been stable anyways, as it is.
Yeah.
If you look at Japan or South Korea, any of those sort of similar societies, the population would have stabilized. All of the drop in the total fertility rate in China is probably disconnected. It's probably not connected so closely to the one child policy. People would have had one
Okay.
child anyways, especially in East Asian
Yep.
cultures. There were never like massive families. There was
Yep.
never the idea that somebody living in the city would have 7 children. There were the idea of, to get that, you need to have usually multiple, you need to have polygamy, and that was never really widely practiced in China.
Mm.
It would have been fine. And that was basically the only outcome. It was just a massive
Well.
disaster that kept going on and on and on, past the point
Mm.
that people started to recognize, oh, it's a very stupid idea. It's a very silly
Yeah.
idea. We don't need it.
Yeah, even the idea in and of itself, if you go back to the fundamentals, the idea that the world is overpopulated is just utterly wrong. And I think
Right.
the way I kind of articulate it is that as soon as people visit places like, for example, so I recently went to Iceland, and
Mm.
the place is literally like, it's literally empty. So I think the people who beat the drum of the overpopulation literally, like they'll abandon their points of view as soon as they visit those places that they see they're actually empty. So I
Right.
think the whole scheme of the overpopulation thing is just not true. Even on the level of countries themselves, if you actually look at the density of countries, it doesn't seem to be true at all. So from
Right.
that perspective, it seems like the overpopulation or stabilizing the population is sort of it's a lost hope when it comes to the argument itself.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I would love if you just could walk us through the history of how it emerged, the one child policy itself, and its link to the Western, I guess, paradigm.
Sure. I mean, you can go quite far back. You can go back to Margaret Sanger, this eugenicist and feminist, an American who visited China in the 1920s and talked to these people who were really, going back to those Enlightenment ideas that were taking root in China, whether it's communism or this paranoia, the idea of eugenics, of making a cleaner, more perfect society. That seed was planted in China in the 1920s. That was popular with Chinese intellectuals at the time. So that idea was kind of cast aside in after the revolution. Mao wasn't a believer that, he said he's had very contradictory statements on that, but he wasn't really interested in the idea that people should reduce the Chinese population. So the people who planned the one child policy in the 1970s were people who inherited those ideas, those ideas from eugenics and from the panic around population going back to the first part of the last century. And those seeds were planted very early on. And then when they went abroad, they met all of these people panicking about overpopulation. There was a big fad for it in the 1970s. This idea that this that this system of Earth is going to be destroyed by rising population. Of course, it was. This is a little bit racist. This particular fad, because these people would go to India and go to Africa and see populations exploding and go taking this Malthusian idea of population is going to outstrip food. Of course, that wasn't happening in the West, but so they were interested in forcing down population in Africa and in the Indian subcontinent, in the Middle East, those kind of places. This gets into a kind of conspiracy theory stuff where a lot of Western NGOs were promoting family planning in sort of the global South or the third world, whatever you want to call it, because they were worried not only about this idea that population would destroy this careful global system, but also the idea that people who were not, white Europeans were going to outbreed, white Europeans. They would be outbred by Indians and Chinese and those kind of people. So that sort of all comes together in the figures that planned the one-child policy in the late 1970s. Song Jian, who's sort of an aristocratic, I think he was Western educated person, and this idea that he's sort of disgusted with the way that people in China are living. He sort of has a sort of hatred of humanity, of people reproducing in the countryside. He's picturing sort of mud huts, perhaps, and just families crawling around on dirt floors and eating a little bit of rough grain to survive on. And his imagination of China in the future is this society governed by science and completely urbanized and perfected, and it is a eugenic idea that by limiting people to one child, you can have a better population. That if you're letting people in the countryside just reproduce freely, you're producing 10 illiterate people of bad genetics for every one person who's having children in the city, who's like 2 children of a PhD. So that's sort of where those ideas all collide. Those ideas of the first half of the century and the ideas of the middle of the century, these Western ideas about sort of paranoia about population, are expressed by Song Jian in his design of a one-child policy, a eugenic policy, a policy to make the Chinese population more perfect and to drive Chinese progress and modernization.
That's interesting, actually. It seems to go in opposition with the idea that science is the thing that will cause progress, because if you say that science or technology is actually a way to go when it comes to humanity, then population shouldn't be a problem for you, it seems, for them, I mean. So there seems to be a lot of contradictions in the idea that there is, like, the planet is overpopulated. Like, if you actually believe in science and technology, then it should even solve the problem of facilitating the basic needs for the people who, even if you have overpopulation, let's say. So
Yeah.
that seems to go in opposition with their philosophy in a lot of ways.
Right. But well, there were
Yeah.
also like population scientists in China who were saying this idea is ridiculous. Of course, the Chinese population will grow. It will stabilize eventually, and of course, it's a problem of resources. We have an underdeveloped countryside, and we have an overdeveloped. The coasts are massively overdeveloped. There are scientific solutions that don't involve sort of a eugenic nationwide policy. You could have just shifted resources elsewhere in the country and plan the economy. You could even have a cybernetic approach to planning the economy to
Exactly.
stabilize the population. It doesn't need to be
Yeah.
just everybody has one child. It's completely, in a sense, very pseudoscientific. It's based on paranoia that that's sort of originated in the West to some extent.
Yeah. So you mentioned the idea of effectors and sensors. Could you just explain what the difference between a sensor and an effector? And you also mentioned it somewhere in the book, in the chapter you wrote
Right.
about weak effectors specifically. So could you just elaborate on that point and how it's maybe linked to the idea of a population or one-child policy?
Sure. So just talking about this idea, this basic idea of cybernetics, that you're sending information back into the system. So if you're driving a rocket, you're sending in an electronic signal that turns a servo motor in a fin of a rocket and changes the direction. Very basic. But if you're talking about something like a human population, what signal do you send into the system? So you have a lot of sensors. You have lists coming in. You can form databases using those sensors. People writing down how many children are born, whatever, their weight when they're born. You have a lot of sensors. A lot of information is being gathered into this system, but there's no clear way that you send a signal into this system. What would it look like? What would that information you send back into the feedback loop or the system look like? Um, uh, in China, in the one-child policy, there's a lot of information about population, and it's very difficult to change that. The Again, we're talking about the trajectory of the population total fertility rate line as like a rocket's trajectory. It's very easy to change a rocket's trajectory by the servo motors in a fin or the boost of the propulsion system, but it's unclear how you do that with a human population. And the result was it failed. There were not many effectors, not many things that could send information into that system to change it.
Mm. Ah, okay, interesting. I think this could also be contrasted to the thing we mentioned in the beginning, which was talking about the first order cybernetics and second order. It seems like the sensors are the first order cybernetics, then the effectors are kind of the second order cybernetics in some ways. I
Sure,
think
that's true.
the effectors are like the practical side of things in some ways.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I want to get a little bit into the idea of writing, actually, since you're a prominent writer, I guess, to shift the gears a little bit.
sure.
So you've written about writer's block, I think, recently, and you talked about
Mhm.
how writer's block it's basically caused by two things. One of them is just being afraid to say a specific thing, and then the other
Mhm.
one is just running out of interesting things to say. So how do you usually overcome this idea of writer's block? And do you usually which one is more common for you? Do you usually experience the not having enough interesting things to say, or do you experience more the fear, I guess, of saying a specific thing, let's say?
Of course, it's the fear of saying certain things is always more powerful because you always have thoughts occurring to yourself through the day, and many of them are thoughts you wouldn't want to share with the world. The problem with having people read what you write is that people will read what you write. When you meet your friends, they'll mention that you said such and such a thing. Um, so that's always a big problem. And of course, as you get older, your ideas are I your filter on your ideas becomes more fine. So when you're young, you'll just write whatever the heck you want to write, and you won't think about the consequences or think that that's a very silly thought that you shouldn't share with anyone. And also, ideas come slower. And as people read things, you want to make them better. So if you have just a thought shooting across your head, you start to think, what can I make that into? This is a thought about the one child policy. What can I turn that into? Is there anything there? The writing on the one child policy came from, in part, what I mentioned before, that interest in cybernetics, but it also came from um, a girl that I met in Guangzhou a long time ago, who I went over to have dinner with her family one afternoon, and she introduced me to her sister, who was never registered because she was a girl born outside the one child policy and lived in the countryside. So that thought that's always gone gone through my head. That memory, there's always an interest in writing about it, but you sort of want to do something more with the idea as you sort of learn the craft of writing, or whatever, you get more mature, you want to turn those passing thoughts into something
Mm.
more, more like something you, some an essay, or a coherent thing. So yeah, how do you break it? It's just a lot of hard work. You just keep writing. For every 100 words I write, maybe two or three get published. There's just, you just write an incredible amount. So there's writer's block, but there's also a block on writing that's worth publishing. So I can always write, I can always blah blah blah, and write things in notebooks, but it's tougher to get something that actually you think people should read.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have that pressure of making something readable, because I think a lot of writers kind of they ditch that pressure behind them. They're like, I'm
Yeah,
just gonna write whatever I want and whatever happens happens. But I think I'm more inclined towards the idea that you should write something that is at least coherent for people to kind of understand and read. Obviously you can write for yourself sometimes, but I guess when it's more public it should be a coherent thing that is actually useful for people in some ways.
right. And I think the
Yeah.
kind of internet and the network economy kind of changes that, where you're sort of incentivized to just throw out whatever it is, because it's just churning more content. You're generating
Yes.
content. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just, those, the little numbers it does will add up. So just keep generating content. If you actually, it's very painful to think, I'm not going to generate any content for 1 week. I'm going to finish this thing and put it out. It's probably not as valuable as if you would just every day put up some passing thoughts there.
Yeah.
There's,
I also have some, to be honest, I also have some sympathy for that viewpoint you actually mentioned, because sometimes sharing something that you don't think is useful might actually be useful for someone. So I think
sure.
there should be some kind of a synthesis between those two perspectives, where sometimes you share your thoughts, like just throw them out there, and sometimes you're like more, I guess, pressured to perfect the art of writing, I guess, in some ways.
And
And how
some
about
people are,
translate? Yeah, go ahead.
some people are really productive, and they manage to just throw out 10 thoughts, and that maybe all of them weren't brilliant, but that one really hit, so it was worth it for them to do so. I don't know
Yeah.
about myself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think because you're more interested in history, so history has more of a, I guess the paradigm of the pressure is more applicable to history rather than other domains in
Mm,
some ways, or
yeah.
also even politics in general. So I think the domains are actually also another factor. And how about translation? Would you say that, how would you juxtapose translation to writing itself? The idea of synthesizing new ideas and translating. Is it really, could it actually be juxtaposed, or is translation just way easier than the act of writing itself, or writing new content, I guess, or information?
Yeah, it's kind of different, because you're still using a lot of intellectual muscle, but it's completely different. You don't need to come up with a big idea. You don't need to say, um, this person, character X, went to the store and experienced thing Y. That's already said, but you need to interpret the language in a beautiful or effective way. But big ideas, which are really hard to come up with sometimes, you don't need to do that, because the big idea
Mhm.
is there. You just need to do the little ideas, which can, of course, take
uh,
some brain power, but um,
just
yeah.
linking
So
the dots basically rather than creating the dots themselves
yeah,
in
so you've
some way.
already got like the sketch of the
Yeah.
thing. It's a picture of a truck. You just, the work of painting in with color is, it takes a lot of work too, but it's not, you didn't come up with the idea of drawing the truck. The truck is already there.
Oh, okay. And do you sometimes translate things to kind of alleviate your writer's block? Because I think I saw you mention that like very briefly, and I might try it, but has it actually worked with you?
Yeah, I think so, because sometimes I don't have a big idea, so it's really fun to, because there's like a million books that nobody has ever read, in, written in
Yes.
Chinese. So at any time I can dip in at random and find this great work of literature, and just enjoy the intellectual aspect of filling in the colors and bringing it into English. And you don't need a big idea, and you can do it anytime you want to. You don't need to think too much on that, at least the hard work of coming up with big ideas. And it's almost like um, you can learn a lot from translation. You can learn because you're going to, if you translate a novel or you translate an essay, you're going to see it, you're going to know it very clearly how everything, if you're just reading it, maybe your attention is not 100% focused. But when you're translating it, you notice how it's structured. You notice that the writer chose this word here to lead into the next paragraph, and you notice the beginning, the middle, and the end, and it sort of gives you when you do finally come up with a good idea yourself, you know exactly how to put it into form. And sometimes it gives you ideas, it inspires you, especially if, like last night, I was translating um, a writer called Zhang Chengzhi. He's a Chinese Muslim writer. I often translate his work if I'm stuck for big ideas, because he's a guy who takes a lot of risks in his writing. So these ideas that perhaps nobody else would put down in writing, he puts it down. It's sort of it's a lot of inspiration. Sometimes I'll be writing something and I'll be thinking in my head that I'm writing it almost like a letter back to him, something
Mm.
written in response to what he wrote.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is there something to be said when it comes to? I guess I wanted to actually ask you about the learning Chinese. How long did it actually take you to learn Mandarin when it comes to the
Well,
number of years?
I guess you're always still learning it, right? You never,
Yeah, I
yeah,
guess,
but
but maybe on a conversational
sure,
level,
yeah.
probably.
On a conversational level, maybe a year could do it, or 6 months.
Ah,
Like if
oh
somebody
wow,
asks you where you're from, what is your thought about this issue, to speak on like a really basic level of like an elementary school student, 6 months to a year. If you want to go and give a speech, or you want to teach a university class, maybe that took like 5 years. um, and to get really purely fluent, I mean, maybe 10 years to be able to.
okay.
Yeah, so it takes a long time.
Yeah, so philosophical level, maybe 5 years, something like that. Like the
Yeah, I think
ability to
so.
kind of translate books and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, about
Ah,
5 years.
okay.
I mean, translation is really easy in a way, because you don't need to. It's a translation is really about your knowing your own language, or knowing the language
Yes.
you're translating into, because you're going to need to know. You can read it in Chinese, you can understand it, but you need to understand what it is in English, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. You have to like have a good grasp of one of the languages at least, and then the other one
That's right.
it's like loose a little bit. Yeah, I
Yeah,
agree.
that's right.
Yeah. Would you say I'll conclude with this question, but I actually wanted to ask you, do you think there's usefulness in the different mediums of sharing information? Like, do you think there's exclusive usefulness in, for example, writing, and then there's exclusive usefulness in speaking? Or do you think they're just interchangeable? You can just write whatever you think and you don't really
No.
need to speak about it to understand it?
Well, when I speak, I, you're very good at this of speaking, just off the cuff. Very good at it, and very good at having a conversation. I'm very
Thank
poor at it. I'm very poor.
you. I disagree, but
No, but I feel, well. Not maybe I'm not poor at it, but I always feel more comfortable writing something, to have a text in
okay.
front of me on a keyboard. Um, I feel much more safe and comfortable knowing that I can edit a sentence and carefully look over a sentence before I speak it out loud. Whereas other forms, whether it's, we're talking about speaking versus writing, I feel very unsafe and very uncomfortable. So that's my
Mm,
feeling about that. Uh,
yeah.
if the internet is pivoting all to video and to people speaking fluently and coherently off the cuff, I'll go out of business. I'll have to go work in a factory or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's exclusive usefulness. Like speaking sometimes builds your kind of your immediate intuition about things, and then writing kind of it makes you pose better questions at things. So I think they both have like exclusive benefits. Like you
Mm.
cannot access the things that are the benefits that are in speaking through writing, and the opposite is true. So that's how I think about it, and that's why I actually like to kind of cultivate both in some ways. Like I don't like
Mm.
to just constrain myself into writing, even though I really, as you said, writing is way more comfortable, even though it might require more cerebral horsepower in some ways,
Yeah.
but it's more comfortable. Like you're just sitting and just writing, you can take your time. But
Yeah.
then when you're speaking, you have to build it on that specific context of that specific person's psychology, of that whatever. So you have almost infinite variables to kind of account for. So I think I try to hone both of them in some ways, and I think it's really important in that way.
I think so too.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this, man. I think that concludes it for my questions. If you have anything to add, anything else to say, go ahead.
No, no. It was a great conversation, but as I said, I'm always uncomfortable, and my memory always fails me as I struggle to make some point that if I had 5 minutes in front of a computer and a keyboard, I could make. So I hope everyone will bear with my rambling or my misstatements.
No, 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 no. I promise you, it's really good. Like I actually understood a lot of the things and the holes I had in the understanding. So don't worry about it.